Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. I'm James Gill.
And I'm Steph McKenna.
From the National Centre for Writing here at Dragon Hall in Norwich.
Earlier in the year, our very own Ellie Reeves from the programme team spoke to local writer James Kinsley. James's first novella, Playtime's Over, was published by Propolis in 2021, a love letter to his native Norwich.
His second book, a collection of interwoven short stories, very David Mitchell, will be released very, very soon, so keep an eye out for that. He also self-publishes sci-fi and fantasy under the name Ray Adams.
Ellie sat down with James following the publication of Playtime's Over. They discuss his journey from self-publishing to traditional publishing and offers an insight into the challenges of drawing personal experiences into your fiction. They also discuss genre, mental health, and the ability of writing to move beyond the writer's intentions.
And now we bring you Ellie Reeves in conversation with James Kinsley.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us, James.
Thank you for having me.
It's such a pleasure to have you here today talking about your writing journey and Playtime's Over, which is your most recent publication with Propolis, which, for those of you who may know, is the imprint of the Book Hive in Norwich. So to get us started, I thought that we could delve into your love of science fiction. Correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I can tell, you're relatively new to writing long-form fiction. You published your trilogy of science fiction back in 2020. So I want to ask about why you decided to embark on that venture, why writing, why that form, and why at that time. Just a little bit about that journey for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have always harboured dreams of being a writer ever since I was going back as far as primary school. One obstacle, though, that was in my way was my own perception of myself and my abilities. So I've suffered from clinical depression most of my adult life. And the way that it impacted my writing is that any time I started a project, I would get so far in, look back over what I've written and think, this is awful. I can't do anything with this. I've got no aptitude for this at all. And that was something that I struggled to get over for decades. And I finally reached a point a few years ago where I realized that the only way I was going to get past that concern of how good what I was writing was if I stopped worrying about it. So I parked a couple of projects that I had that I was excited and hopeful about to one side. And I thought, I'm just going to write a story, write a book that's light, that's fun, that I'm not as emotionally involved in. And I will deliberately not care about how it turns out, because the important thing will be if I finish it, it will exist. And that in itself will have that quality that none of my ideas that are in my head have. So I sat down and started writing something that turned out to be my first science fiction book. And yeah, completely didn't allow myself to judge it in any form, just let it happen. And was pleasantly surprised when I got to the end that it seemed to hang together. So it was, I was pleased with how it turned out. I was pleased with how it ended particularly. And I thought, this is actually not too bad. So after editing and sort of tidying it up, I put it on Wattpad for a bit. And then I thought, well, actually I could self-publish and actually see if anyone will buy it. So that's what started me off with that. It was a project aimed at dealing with my own insecurities rather than anything else. And it just turned out better than hoped.
Great. And also it's not just one book, it's 3, which is incredible. That's 3 completed pieces of fiction, which is a huge achievement in and of itself. And of course, it's a huge emotional release from just completing a project.
No,
I think most
absolutely.
writers are familiar with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that went against everything that I'd thought, because I had in my head science fiction. It's always trilogies. It's always saving the universe. And I wanted to, and I had thought to myself, if I'm going to start off with something, I want it to be small. I want it to be self-contained. And the first book does stand on its own. But yeah, I kind of found myself in that place where I understood what the temptation was to persist with an idea that you've, stick with characters, follow them further. So I ended up writing a trilogy against my own better judgment. But yeah, it again turned out to be better than I had hoped. And certainly the people who have read the first one responded well to it. So that was an encouragement. And it really kind of opened the floodgates for me, because from that moment, I was able to really up my creative output and focus on writing a lot more, because it gave me that first step of belief of thinking, no, actually I can do this. This is something that I can achieve. So yeah, it was a huge positive for me.
That's so lovely to hear. And I do want to spend a lot of our time together today discussing genre, and a piece obviously is a lot emotionally closer to you and the dynamic between those two things. But first, you've talked about the process of self-publishing through Amazon. And we have briefly touched on this in the past on the podcast with Nicola May was the most recent, I believe. So if, for our listeners, if that is of interest to you, please go and check that out. But I think it would be lovely to hear your perspective on self-publishing the Ruraka trilogy through Amazon and how the actual experience of doing that was. So how was that for you once you decided to publish it that way?
From a technical point of view, I was astonished at how straightforward it was. I was really pleasantly surprised to find that, what they've created for self-publishing authors is actually an amazing platform. You can, if you've got a finished draft, you can have that online and people buying it within minutes, 10, 15 minutes. You can turn a Word document into a saleable book, which is incredible. And that kind of direct access to the means of production, if you like, was it's incredible. I do think they've created something really good there. There are, of course, pitfalls as well with that kind of access. The fact that anyone who wants to can write a book and publish it is obviously fantastic, but it does also come with it's a double-edged sword, because it means that anyone who wants to can publish. So it's overall, I think it's a very positive thing, and it gives you a sense of control and a sense of freedom, which I think is invaluable, because you're doing the selling, you're putting your name out there, you're in control of every aspect of it, from pricing to how you market it to how you advertise it. And I found it a really fun process. It's not anything that, I'm not going to retire off the back of it, but it's, but from a personal level of just being able to understand everything that goes into it, because it's not the thing with being a writer these days, is that the writing, the job doesn't finish when you've written the book. There's so much more. If you want to sell it, you've got to be an active participant in that. And that is whether you're traditionally publishing or self-publishing. More so with self-publishing, obviously, because you're the only person going to bat for your book. But even it set me up really well for my journey with traditional publishing, because I understood what was needed. I understood that I would have to play an active part in things like promotion. I would have to be aware of opportunities to market and that kind of thing. It was a invaluable preparatory exercise, but it was also really fun in its own right.
Nice. So it sounds like one of the major advantages for you of self-publishing was a demystifying of the process of publishing, which of course gives a huge amount of power back to the writer if you then decide, as you have done, to move into traditional publishing and work with a publisher like Propolis. Would you say that's fair? You understood that process from A all the way through to Z before you even really worked with a publisher?
Yeah, absolutely. Even simple things like going into that first conversation with a publisher and not being blindsided by terms that you don't understand. It's the whole frame of reference for the process of taking a text and turning it into a book, because they are two different things. And so when I sat down and had my first conversation with my publisher, I felt a lot better equipped to understand what he was talking about, to ask the questions that arose from my experience of publishing myself. I generally felt better equipped. And obviously I defer to my publisher in many things in terms of his quite incredible experience, but I was nevertheless able to have those conversations with some sense of not being completely out of my depth, which again, for someone who has issues around self-confidence and self-worth, that extra step of being better equipped was invaluable, because I could quite easily see that if I'd just gone into that blind, that I could have felt so overwhelmed by the process that I might have sabotage myself and not pursued it as far as I did. So yeah, definitely it's knowledge, and having that knowledge is a huge plus point.
Completely. There's a lot of discussion of imposter syndrome amongst writers at all stages of their career as well, whether they have completed a draft or whether they are 5 books in. It just seems to pop up as this recurring issue that writers struggle with, of never being sure that what they're putting down onto the page is going to have worth. And of course it does. Of course it does, as soon as you've found your audience and your people. But even the act of completion is a catharsis in and of itself.
Couldn't agree more. There's that whole thing of imposters, and I find as well with social media, the fact that you're able to engage with your audience and with other writers allows you to see that even people who are a lot further along in their career still experience that, and that being able to know writers better in a sense, through that kind of access to them, again, really kind of opens the doors for people, because you can see that, it's okay. Other people feel like this.
There's so much to be found in other writers. On that note, do you involve yourself in any writers group, or how do you create that writer community for yourself?
I've never participated in any kind of live sort of face-to-face writers group. I've had it suggested to me in the past, and I know people who really value that opportunity. But the idea of sitting in a room and reading my writing out to people really is just makes my skin itch. But yeah, so again, actually, that whole social aspect of being online does allow you to build connections, and just even if you're not an active participant, because I'm not naturally a very gregarious person, but just being able to see what other people are going through and hear their stories and their experiences, even if I'm a bit tentative about offering my own, it's a huge thing. It's fantastic. So yeah, I would very much recommend for anyone who's thinking about writing to kind of make those connections and start seeing other people's experiences, from the hugely successful to the just starting out, because that really gives you a lot more of an appropriate frame of reference of what to expect, but also how to feel about the things that you'll experience, and how it's okay to feel the way you do and still carry on doing it. That's for me that is the big key. Is it's fine if you feel imposter syndrome. I mean, I struggle with that regularly, but knowing that everyone else does as well, just it takes that pressure off and thinks, well, okay, this is fine. Just ignore it. Just accept the fact that you feel like that and carry on anyway.
Yeah, and of course, in Playtime's Over, the focus of the book is a lot on mental health. So it's interesting that a lot of your experiences, just as a human being, are feeding directly into this book. So I'd like to delve into the book now. I want us to focus on Playtime's Over. And just before we really dig into a discussion of the novella, I'm just going to share the blurb. In the seconds before death, Will finds himself transported from the depths of the North Sea to the end of a deserted pier. Deserted until Victor appears. Together they journey across time and place, scrutinising the interminable balancing act of being alive, which ultimately led Will to make his final fatal move. Playtime's Over is a story about resilience and surrender, told with darkly absurd humour. It is both a powerful meditation on mental health in a world with little refuge, and a touching portrait of a friendship forged in the most bizarre circumstances. So to start, let's discuss mental health. You are a huge advocate for using your own experiences to inform your writing. But of course, that puts a huge amount of yourself into this novella, which is a tricky balance to maintain. And I would love to hear about how that was for you and the challenges that you faced and how you were able to navigate them to create a text that at the end is just excellent. And I have read multiple times now, and each time I gain something new from it. So what was that like for you?
It's made a lot easier by the fact that I've blogged about my mental health issues for many years now. I went through a particularly rough period approximately 10, 12 years ago now, where through the impact of my mental life on my working life, I ended up out of work. And as a result of which, it was that, although I had talked about it sort of before at that point, it became a thing that I actually need to explain to the people around me what's happened. And the only way to do that is to be absolutely honest about my mental health situation. And from there, largely due to the really positive feedback that generated, I've talked ever since about it. And my mental health has changed over the years. So what in my 20s manifested itself in sort of depression and self-sabotaging behavior, I have less of that, but I have more anxiety episodes. And so chronicling that journey has been a really positive and useful thing. And I've found it really, really great when other people have responded to that and sort of opened up about their own experiences, because it is one of those truisms that the more you talk about it, the more you realize the people around you are experiencing the same thing. So when it came to channeling that into Playtime, it was surprisingly easy, because so much of myself I put out there anyway that I don't think there are any massive surprises left to share. There were challenges for sure. I mean, one of them was my wife, when she read the book, reacted quite strongly to certain parts of it, from recognizing bits of me, bits of my life, bits of our life in it, almost to the point that I hadn't even thought about it while I was writing it. So it was a surprise to me when she reacted as strongly as she did, favorably, I should add. But yes, it was, accommodating myself to the perceptions of the people who know and who love me was perhaps one of the biggest challenges with that. And I do have to be careful when because Will in the book is not only contemplating but actually going through with the act of suicide, I do need to always be careful about drawing that line between where I stop and the character starts, because that's not. It is a work of fiction. It's more than a cry for help. So, but yeah, having been open about mental health for such a long time was made that whole journey of channeling that into fiction a lot easier than it might otherwise have been. And I think that's it's paid dividends, because people have responded to the book so well, and they feel the authenticity in that, because the voice, although a fictional character, nevertheless comes with quite a lot of my emotional journey behind it as well. So that's generally a very positive thing, although yes, challenging in sort of waking me up to other people's perceptions of both me and the book.
That's incredibly interesting, and first of all, it's wonderful to hear that the book has been received in such a positive light. Of course, that is wonderful, and that people have found a sort of a community in shared experience of that and an understanding. And that makes me think actually of a comment that I think was said by a previous translator in residence at the National Centre for Writing, Yvette Sigert, I believe, said this. She said that the act of writing is very much like breathing. We breathe out, which is writing, but before we can do that, we have to breathe in, which is reading and consumption and fueling what inevitably we put out, and that process is ongoing and doesn't stop. And I feel that particularly with Playtime's Over, with such a focus on mental health and such an informed discussion that's happening inside the text and the questions that are asked, what other things have influenced how you decided to approach that text? Because it's done incredibly carefully and with a lot of thought. And I wondered if there are other texts that you've read or other conversations of mental health that you've been involved with that you think would be worthy of sharing.
The influences one, certainly the literary influences, I would struggle to pin down. I flatter myself that I've come up with something that's not quite like anything that I've read, although I'm certain there are, I've had people come back to me and say, oh, this part reminds me of this book, or Matt Haig's The Midnight Library is something that I've had suggested to me, although I do own a copy, but I haven't read it yet. But yeah, certainly other experiences of people I know who have suffered and do continue to live with mental health issues. I have one very good friend who's bipolar, and his experiences have been a lot more extreme than mine and a lot more difficult to deal with than mine. And certainly that, in the back of my mind, if not necessarily at the forefront, would have been something that informed it greatly. I've known people who have taken their own lives, or friends whose relatives have taken their own lives. So it is something that has sort of weighed on me quite heavily at different times. And so, yeah, I feel that it was born a lot more out of personal experience than it was literary inspiration. Although I do, I read an enormous amount, so it would be foolish to pretend that there wasn't, a whole range of literary influences that have kind of drip fed into me over the years. I think I did come to, this feels like I've come to writing sort of quite late in life, but I think one of the advantages of that is it has allowed me to sort of more naturally find my own voice amongst the voices that I've been taking in. So yeah, it's kind of crystallized in Playtime, which has in essence become this very sort of personal journey for me. And particularly as well with one of the things that, because the book is funny. It even makes me laugh out loud when I read it now. And part of that is down to Victor. And I suppose in some ways, if I identify with either of the two characters in the book, although they are in essence the same character, but it's that Victor side of the character, that sort of punctuating of the almost pomposity of Will's depression and his self-absorption and all the angst that he feels that I share with him. It's that Victor side of his personality that's saying, is that really the case? Is that, are you overthinking this? Is this really the problem that you think it is? That's a kind of more quintessential part of me. And that, again, I've had people suggest that there's almost a kind of Arthur Dent Ford Prefect kind of relationship between those two characters. And you've got the one person who's wildly out of his depth, and this other voice inside that actually is a lot more clued into what's going on. So that's something that, has fed in sort of inspirational wise and sort of drip fed a bit into creating this piece.
That brings me nicely on to asking about Victor. Of course, I wanted to ask about Victor. He's such a major part of the book, and clearly a character that has been loved whilst writing. I think that definitely comes across. So it's interesting to hear that is who you see yourself in. I think that does come across in the text. So Victor in particular, there's a warmth and a familiarity, but he's also quite stoic. And so whilst the novella is a lot about Will, what really comes across is that it's actually a novella centered on a budding friendship in a very bizarre circumstance. And I wanted to know if that was your initial intention. How did that happen over the course of coming up with the concept and then writing the book? At what point did you realize that this was also a book about friendship?
Quite late on. In some ways, when Henry put the blurb together and he mentioned it about, being this friendship forged in the most bizarre circumstances, it almost kind of blindsided me. The moment I read it, I was like, but of course, but it certainly wasn't intentional. And I think a lot of that has come out of the fact that it's a product of how late I've come to this and how much the story has almost been fermenting in my mind before I wrote it down. And it was this whole idea of actually coming to a point where I've accommodated my own issues and problems and learned to live with them, and the kind of the way that I've learned not to take myself too seriously. And this is, I think, Victor's essence in the story is communicate or trying to sort of get Will to see that you can be right about something and you can feel the correct way about an issue in the world, and yet still that can manifest itself in an unhealthy way. So, I mean, a lot of the things that I deal with in the book, it makes reference to our departure from the EU. It makes reference to transgender issues. And whilst I feel very strongly about those issues, I like to think that the book is actually accessible to people who might not agree with me, purely because I do try to subvert that a little bit, in the sense of I don't necessarily trust my own opinions about what is right. I don't believe I'm infallible. If there's one thing that frightens me in the world, I always say it's other people's certainty. And I don't value certainty as a good quality. It's something I find off-putting in other people, but it's also something that I have to remember to apply that to myself. So when I find myself getting angry about something, or, getting really impassioned about something, it's about examining those feelings and thinking, okay, am I right about this? And quite often when I go through that exercise of self-evaluation, I'll come out the other side and I think, no, I do still think that, I do still believe that about that issue. But just taking that time to evaluate my own approach to it and think about how I'm feeling about something gives me that brief pause to think, okay, yes, you are on the right side of this issue, but what do you do with that? Where do you go from here? How do you communicate with others? How do you put this across in a way that isn't just shouting at people, but is, trying to communicate, and in a way that doesn't make it look like you're claiming some kind of superiority, moral superiority or intellectual superiority that you don't have. And I think the one interesting thing about Will and Victor's situation, and one of the other aspects of the book that didn't really strike me until I finished it, is the theme of isolation and how isolated as a character Will has been. And in fact, this conversation that he has with Victor throughout the book is exactly the sort of conversation that, had he been able to have that with someone in his life, he wouldn't have ended up in the place that he was at. And that's one of the essential differences between me and Will as a character, is the fact that I have, that network of support, those friends that I can talk to and family I can talk to, that means that the conversations that Will has been denied, and the denial of which has led to where he is, I don't share. So yeah, it is, although they are in essence the same character, the book does boil down to being about a relationship. It's a relationship between Will and Victor. And from that point of view, I guess in some senses it's about trying to have a more positive relationship with yourself, about being more forgiving, but also more skeptical about some of your more entrenched beliefs. Because I think I think most people would agree that actually a little bit more self-evaluation for all of us would probably be a good thing.
Yes, I agree with that very much. And I enjoy that some of these realizations for you as the writer of the text are actually happening after the fact. I think that speaks to the nature of writing and finishing a project, and how as soon as it's in the hands of the writers, and the hands of the readers even, whether that be your editor or a member of the public, they start to point out all these things that you never even noticed.
No, absolutely. And I think it's an important part of our relationship with art, is that we should never, as the creator of art, be it literature or be it anything else, we should never assume that we've got a monopoly on understanding it. And so, I'm more than happy for people to turn around and say, you do realize that you've said this, or that this is coming across. And I think, oh yeah, of course, I didn't see that. And it's possible not to see things in your own work. And I guess that, if we go full circle, that comes back to this whole idea of not being too sure of your own certainties and your own infallibility. It's that willingness to be told things about something you have created I think is healthy, because it does kind of opens you up to the thing that you have created more, so you can get more out of it. But it also helps you develop, so when you come to the next project and the next thing you write, those things that might otherwise not have been in your mind, you are now thinking, oh yeah, I've done that already. And yeah, this has come through. I've got a work in progress at the moment. I've got a first draft for where one of my friends has come back to me. He was reading through it for me at the first draft stage, and he was drawing parallels with Playtime that I hadn't noticed. And he was saying, you do know you've kind of done this a bit before. And I thought, oh, yeah, no, he's absolutely right. I have. This does need perhaps reworking a bit. So, yeah, being open to other people's interpretation of your own work is a vital part of the process for me.
Absolutely. And how exciting to hear that there's another project in the works. Perhaps we can come back to that at the end and leave everybody with a little flicker of excitement about that. But I want to ask more about genre, because from what you've just said, I think Playtime's Over is filled with questions, and it's filled with questions in a way that I find quite reminiscent of poetry, in the way that it doesn't need to answer them. It is quite happy to ask them, to have a bit of a discussion about them, but it does not feel a need to answer them before moving on to the next question. And that's quite a powerful thing, and it's quite a poetic thing. I think Lewis Buxton has spoken on the podcast previously about how he tries to do that in his work about masculinity. He asks the question, and then he's quite happy to leave the reader with it and let them reach their own conclusions or not, and that's the point. And it's interesting that you've changed genre from science fiction and from fantasy elements to this novella, which is definitely not science fiction, but it is grappling with some of those same questions that have come up. For instance, questions of what it means to be human and what it's all for and what it's about. And that's very interesting, because as you're growing as a writer and as you move on to this new project, how do you see the genres that you're going to be utilizing evolving? Do you feel that you'll return to science fiction, or are you sort of enjoying this much closer approach to what you're writing? And maybe you can talk a little bit about your new draft there, if you would like to.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, yeah, I'm a huge enthusiast for genre fiction. I don't at all draw the kinds of lines that are often drawn between the two. I don't see there being any kind of hierarchy in literature. And as you've so succinctly drawn out, one of the things about science fiction, and certainly the top end, the best end of science fiction, is all about what does it mean to be human. And in the same way that when it comes down to it, pretty much all art is that any genre, any art form, at its essence, it's all about us trying to make sense of the things we experience and what's going on around us. And the best science fiction has always done that. And not even the most sort of highbrow science fiction, but I mean, even more, readily accessible stuff like Star Trek. I mean, you take someone like Spock or Data, and their journey throughout those shows has always been about exploring what it means to be human, which I think is amazing. And I think people who look down on science fiction and fantasy really miss an awful lot of what those genres have to offer. For me personally, I like to think that when I come to the end of doing everything that I've done, there's likely to be far more science fiction and fantasy than there is more contemporary literature. I find it in some ways easier to draw that out. I do worry about authenticity and sort of creating something that feels real. And for me personally, I find it easier to achieve that in a world where I'm setting the rules. And I think actually there's an awful lot of skill that goes into creating authentic, convincing fiction within our own world, because the moment you start telling a story that other people will recognize, then you need to get it right. Now, that's not to downplay the abilities of the rigor with which sci-fi writers go about their craft at all, but it's the further you go from everyday experience, the more control you have over what you're creating. That comes with the responsibility of making it coherent and reflective, but there's certainly more leeway in some respects for that. But yeah, I respect the genre enough that I don't feel I'm one of these people who has to create slipstream fiction and then sort of make arguments about whether or not it is sci-fi. I'm quite happy to have Playtime and one of the pieces that I'm currently working on sitting very much on one shelf, and my science fiction work sitting very comfortably on another shelf. I've no problem with genre from that point of view, because it's, it is useful to the reader to know what they're picking up, and there's no harm in sort of having your feet in both pools, or as many pools as you want. It's and I do want to, I want to try other things as well. So I'm hoping that I might have a really good comic novel in me at some point, something that's just flat out funny. So yeah, I want to push myself and try new things and different things, rather than sort of just retreading ground. But whether that's in genre or whether that's in more sort of contemporary literature, both both give me pleasure. And I find one of the advantages as well when you're working in different genres, and particularly if you have more than one work in progress on the go, which I do at the moment, writer's block becomes less of an issue. Because if you reach a point in a story where you think, I'm not 100% sure where I'm going now or where this goes, put it aside. Don't worry about it. Think, okay, well, I can go and hop over to this world and work there for a while. And that, for me personally, I know everyone will sort of work differently, but that's enormously useful for me, because it allows me to write better and engage more with what I'm writing, because I've got that choice of what I'm doing at any given moment.
I think that's a powerful tool to have in the roster of a writer. We certainly do not need to stick to a particular genre, and it's lovely to hear that you've actually found a strength in that variety rather than anything else. Having said that, though, it would be so lovely to see a couple more trilogies pop out in a very intense, fully immersive sci-fi world. So let's not rule it out. Let's keep it in the cards.
Absolutely. There's a new Ray Adams book, hopefully sort of landing. Ray Adams being the name I self-publish under. There's a new book on its way, hopefully in about April time, by the time I get it proofread. And yeah, I've got I've got about 4 works in progress at different stages at the moment in different genres. So yeah, I'm kind of keeping busy.
Fantastic. That's so exciting to hear. Do you think the plan will be to self-publish or try something a bit different with the next one?
So I definitely want to keep with the self-publishing. As I was saying at the beginning, there's the freedom that comes with that, and just the investment with being involved in the whole process and being responsible for that, and watching your sales figures and looking at the charts and all this kind of thing. I'm an absolute addict for a spreadsheet. So yeah, it's self-publishing is a gift, because there's so many things you can put in a spreadsheet with it. But so yeah, I definitely want to continue in both veins if possible. I have to accept the fact that traditional publishing it's very difficult to get into. And although I've done it once, there's no guarantee that I'm going to get a second shot. So realistically, I have to keep self-publishing ongoing. But that is as I say, that's a choice as well as just a backup. I don't see it as a backup. That is just one strand of what I want to do. But yeah, I'm also hoping that Playtime won't be my last traditionally published book, but that lies sort of that's out of my hands in some ways. So yeah, it's good to have both options open.
And my last question for you, I think, just to bring us back to the sort of focus of this discussion, do you envision, and you may not know the answer, but do you envision mental health remaining a very central focus of your texts, or how do you envision that changing in the future?
That's an interesting one, because in some respects it will continue to be a very big part of it, simply because it's part of my experience. It's part of who I am, and therefore I don't think successfully going to be able to take it out of the equation. I mean, even with the sci-fi, the trilogy that I've self-published, although in some senses is a very much just a knockabout adventure, it's a bit of a caper really. There is nevertheless in the middle book a kind of quite big chunk that centers on one character's ability to deal with the occurrences of the first book. He takes a lot of time getting over that, and that's something that I explored that very much came from my own mental health background, even within that kind of fun caper genre. But I do also have to be careful that I don't end up in a place where I don't want to pigeonhole myself as being just a writer about mental health. I want to do different things, and I want to surprise people. I want some. My dream is for someone to read 2 books of mine and not even realize they're by the same person. That's how diverse I want to make that, and I'm not going to achieve that by sticking with the same themes and hammering on those things. So there's definitely a balance between creating books that are relevant to my experience and authentic in that regard, but also pushing myself to not take the comfortable route of just doing the same thing over and over. So yeah, I honestly don't know which way it will go, but I hope I do manage to sort of diversify.
I have no doubt that you will be able to diversify. I particularly enjoyed the small ode in the sea of discussion of mental health in Playtime's Over. I did catch the slight Star Wars reference of I don't like sand. So that did not go unnoticed, and it was greatly appreciated, and just won many moments of good humour in there. So clearly it is well within your ability and your tool set to swap between the two. I'm very excited actually to see how you do that and to follow your writing career.
Well, thank you, Ellie. That's great. Yeah, that is one line that does always get a very positive response to the people who recognise it. I like to think it's subtle enough that if it doesn't resonate, then it's absolutely fine. It just slips by. But for the people who pick it out, it always gets a big thumbs up. So yeah.
Yes. It's very much if you know, you know. Absolutely.
I was glad I was able to slip that one past my publisher, because there were quite a few of that kind of thing that he took out, and rightly so. But I'm glad that one got through.
It's sort of a little secret that we will now publish, of course.
Absolutely.
Onto the Spotify,
an Easter egg.
That's okay. An Easter egg. Great. So on that note, James, I think we're going to bring this conversation to a close. It has been such a pleasure talking to you. And thank you as well for being so candid about your process of writing and putting yourself into your work. I'm sure it's going to help so many writers who are at a similar stage or considering starting writing, that the possibilities are endless and they just need to crack on.
Absolutely. Go for it.
If you have questions or want to get in touch, you can find us on Instagram and Twitter @Writers Centre, and you'll find us on Facebook by searching National Centre for Writing. Don't forget to sign up to our weekly newsletter by visiting nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk and clicking the orange drop-down box on the homepage.
As a UK registered charity, we rely on the generosity of our supporters to make our work possible. You can make a donation over on the website today by hitting the Support Us button in the top nav.
Don't forget to subscribe, rate and review us, because it helps other writers to find the podcast.
Thanks again, keep writing, and we'll catch you on the next episode.